We're live.
Cool. Good evening, everybody.
Hey, it's Wednesday night.
It's Wednesday night.
This is
Here we go.
we're calling it Table Talk now because we got an official name
And we have an official table.
and a
Right.
table, so
And we do lots of talking.
And yeah,
it makes sense.
yeah. Hopefully, we all well. We are going to go into exactly what we told you guys we were going to go into. We're gonna talk a little bit about eschatology, which is
Study of the last things or end times.
there you go. Study of last things, end times. We asked you guys to look at Matthew 24, and we will kind of move through that passage tonight. I don't know how long this is going to take, so like get your snugglies, humpies on, big cup of something.
I thought we discouraged that on Sunday.
Well,
We did.
Stretchy pants.
Wednesday
Yeah.
night is they can hunker
They can
down.
do
Sundays,
stretchy pants.
If
Is
you're
okay.
still wearing the same stretchy pants from Sunday, we need to talk.
Yeah,
that's
At
a
least I
problem.
hope they're new.
That is
they're
true.
new stretchy pants.
that
Right.
is absolutely
By the way, if you do have to miss tonight, or if you have to check out for a while, these are on the YouTube channel after the fact, so you can tune in later and watch them.
We do post them on Facebook as well. And then Jordan set up, I think today, they're on our website now. So if you go under sermons on the website, there's a link to the YouTube feed there as well. So
Perfect.
lots of ways that you can access these after the fact.
Also, questions. If you have questions, you can go ahead and ask those questions during the duration of what we're doing up here. We will get to them at the end. So when we're kind of done moving through the text and talking about some of the things that we're going to be discussing, we'll hit that at the end of it. So we will get there, but you can go ahead and just send them in real time as you have them. That will be fine. So we are going to set out to talk about a topic that is pretty, like, it could be controversial. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to divide us. In fact, it shouldn't divide us. It's one of those things that we hold loosely because it doesn't change the person and work of Jesus Christ in our lives and what binds us together and unifies us in the gospel. It's more just, people with differences on when certain things are going to go down or how they're going to go down, and that doesn't need to be divisive. Divisive. There we go.
Divisive.
I don't know why I heard it that
Divisive
way.
if you're from England.
If you're from England,
Oh, is that what
Yeah.
it
it's
is?
divisive.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be divisive.
Perfect.
That was good.
That was really good.
Like that.
We're going to go ahead and say this. There are many, many super brilliant, super godly men throughout history that have fallen on different places when it comes to eschatology. And so I think that should give us all an idea. It should set us at ease, and it should also cause us to open up our hands a little bit and not think that we have to have this figured out, because there are a lot of men that again love their Bibles and know them inside and out and didn't have it figured out. And so we're going to talk about this. We're going to try to learn and extract the things out of the text that we feel like we can extract, things that are solids and not things that create a bunch of guesswork. And I think that's the main thing that we're going to try to accomplish here tonight. And hopefully it'll be edifying. In fact, when we look at eschatology, if it's not edifying, if it's not encouraging, if it's not exciting, if it's not hope-giving, if it's not glorifying to our coming King that's going to come back for his church, then we've done it wrong. And so we want to make sure that you guys are encouraged and pumped up about what we talk about. I will say that you'll probably be a little bit disappointed, some of you, in this. You probably have high expectations that we're going to reveal, like solve some riddles for you, and it may not go that way. I will say that we have all had an interest in eschatology, and there's I know personally I've spent a lot of time in my Christian life in eschatology, and the longer that I spend in it, the looser my hands get. It's just the farther you go down the rabbit hole biblically, I believe God pulls us away from what we think we know in the details and just says, it's all about my son coming back for his church. And so we're going to definitely focus on that.
Real
go
quick,
ahead.
when it comes to the questions, by the way, when you do send them in, we're not going to name names because we realize when it comes to this kind of thing, if you feel like it's a silly question or a dumb question or whatever, you may not want us to read your name out loud. And so we won't name names.
Yep.
It'll be anonymous unless, it's, no, I'm just kidding. It'll be anonymous. We'll keep it that way. So you don't have to worry about that. And the phone number, I know it doesn't display. If you can see the comments, Jordan posted the phone number for texting, but if you can see the comments, you can also just type the comment to the question there. So it's 541-280-2171. It's just my cell. If you've ever gotten one of my business cards, it's on there too, but that's it.
Are you getting them too, Chad?
I'm watching the comments that are coming in on the YouTube chat.
Cool.
Brent's
Perfect.
watching the text
All right,
comments.
perfect. So we're going to start this way. There's three things that we want to briefly talk about before we get into the text that tend to be traps that people get into when looking at eschatology. And so we want to briefly talk about three traps to avoid when you get into studying eschatology. The first one is something that we mentioned last Wednesday night, presuppositions, which is just to presuppose something, to already have your mind made up about something without all of the information, or a construct that you've been taught and you just thought, I like this construct, so I'm not going to hear anything else. Baggage is another way to put it. Presuppositions are basically baggage. We all have it. We bring it from all kinds of places all over the Bible. And so we want to try to set that baggage down before we walk into the text tonight. So that's one trap that needs to be avoided, especially with eschatology, is that we all recognize we have baggage and we intentionally set it aside. Do you guys want to add to that?
I would just say in regards to the different views that are out there, you know, and again, I don't know how much of this you guys know, and we'll get there, but I remember being taught that, well, ours is the right view and they have a bunch of stupid views out there. And the truth is, if you come into it with that kind of a mindset, you're not going to pay attention to those views. The truth is, as you study these out, you find out these are really intelligent people that have got a good biblical argument for the views they hold. And so that's part of the baggage, is don't come in thinking that these are all dumb ideas, because, you know, you might be the one finding out that yours isn't as good as theirs. That happened to me. So
yeah, if you come in thinking you've got it figured out, then you're coming in with the wrong disposition. So anyone else want to add to the presupposition thing?
I think I just add, you know, depending on what books or movies you may have read, those typically tend to be a little more Hollywood than biblical. So, you know, those are some presuppositions to definitely put aside right now.
Yeah, even in our culture, we definitely have some of those in our media entertainment, for sure. The second trap that we want to avoid is personalization. And what we mean by that is that we need to realize we are not always the central character of every prophetic passage in the Bible, nor is the time we live in necessarily the central time that's being spoken of. Like, for instance, tonight, Jesus is going to be teaching us something. It doesn't mean that he had us or our time that we live in mind necessarily. And we tend to come to the Bible and personalize it in a way that we're the central character and Jesus is thinking of me. Not necessarily so when it comes to the details of eschatology. Mm-hmm. Agreed? Anyone want to add to that? All right, so we want to avoid that trap.
Just that the way that we wander into that trap is that we start with, what does this mean to me? Mm-hmm. And as we're going through this tonight, and probably somewhere along the line, we'll have a kind of a small, talk about hermeneutics, or the science, if you want to call it that, of interpretation of the Bible. And we start out, well, not with the question, what does it mean to me? But the first question is, what did it mean to the people that were there, the immediate people? We have to answer that question. Not only do we have to answer that question, we have to answer that question first before we can start getting anywhere near what does it mean to me. It's what did it mean to them, the ones in the immediate audience, the ones that heard it, wrote it, read it, and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us right into the third trap we can fall into, which is open interpretation, where we do whatever we feel like doing with the text because it makes sense to us. That's a no-no. Nobody should be reading their Bible that way. If you do, you're going to come up with a lot of weird things. And so again, what is hermeneutics? It's a weird word. What is hermeneutics, Mr. Terry, or whoever?
Herman who?
Hermeneutics.
Yeah, Herman who?
That's not a dude. You already said it. Just repeat it.
Well, it's just the science. It comes from a Greek word, but it's the science of interpretation. Hermes was the god of the Greeks that did explaining. Okay, and so that he interpreted the rest of the gods. And so that's where the word comes from. Actually, as like a kind of a pagan source, but it has come nonetheless to mean the science of interpreting your Bible. And there are, and while it's not, I would say, an exact science, there are some really simple, universal rules that we can follow in interpreting our Bibles. It'll help us a lot. And then when we get down to the fine points, where then it kind of, but most of the hermeneutical mistakes, I think, are made on very basic things. I mean, that's the ones that when I'm reading myself, I have to guard against, are the simple ones, not the obscure ones.
Yeah. Well, everybody has, they don't, whether you realize it or not, you're employing hermeneutics when you read the Bible, because if you just go in and read one verse and forget about the ones before it and after it, you're going to come up with all kinds of crazy stuff. So context, for instance, is part of a hermeneutical basis for the way we read the Bible, and culture and setting, and lots of different things like that. So that's the idea.
Exactly. And you even brought it up, and this is super important. Like, we always have to ask ourselves, like, who's being immediately talked to? Like tonight, that's going to matter too in the text we're in. And what's the intention of the author? Like, authorial intent is another reality. As best as we can know that gives us a proper hermeneutic or track to interpret from, is by knowing the intent of the author. So what we want to do is be really careful, all that said, to come in and over literalize everything that we see when some things aren't meant. In fact, the text sometimes gives us a hint that this is supposed to be descriptive. It's like this, but not this. And there's figures of speech and stuff like that. We need to pay attention to those things. We also, with eschatology, want to be careful not to come in and just allegorize everything. Nothing's literal. Everything's just kind of thrown into the air, and we can't know anything that's being said. So the trick or the science is for us to come in and use the text itself and the people that are being talked to and the authorial intent to be able to navigate how we should take each thing. Does that make sense? Are you guys confused enough now? All right, good.
Let me confuse just a little bit more. The other thing that's important to know, just as you roll up your sleeves to begin into a text, and we'll need to know that tonight, is what is the historical context? In other words, not only what is the author telling us about, but what's going on around it, or what's happened right before it, what's going to happen after it, and the historical context of the event that the author is describing is a huge, sometimes a huge clue and huge tool in helping us interpret what the author is talking about.
That's right. That's right. You guys good with that?
Great.
The only other one I would say is that, and we've already talked about this, but maybe you were going to, is we always want to make sure we go to the very clearest passages.
That's right.
You don't go to a lot of times we want to go to Daniel and Revelation and start there to try to understand things. Those are harder passages because they're full of symbolism. So we want to go to the most clear passages and get a base, kind of a basis for what we're looking at. And then before we go to the other one. So don't start with the obscure stuff. Start with what we definitely can know, and then move on.
We want a strong foundation if we're gonna fall strongly somewhere in what the Bible's teaching us. And I do want to clarify that. I'm glad you remembered that, because last week I made a comment about Revelation, that we're really not going to spend time in Revelation because that's really not the place to go. The way that came out is probably wrong. What I meant to say is what Brent just said, is that's not a good starting point if you're trying to build an eschatology, because it's written in signs. It's written in Revelation. John there is trying to describe things that he has no idea what they are. And so for us to go there and try to build a strong foundation of eschatology, that's hard. So it's better to go to stronger texts, stronger foundations, and then reference places like Daniel 9, reference places
Don't
like
start with the dragons and the horses and the symbols,
Exactly.
harlots riding.
Thanks for bringing
dragons.
that up. So those are three things that we want to, traps that we want to try to avoid when looking at eschatology. Now we have to talk about dualistic prophecy. There is a thing that is not the exception. It seems to be more the rule from the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament. And this is something that it's probably even the wrong term. I don't know. I've always just called it that. Dualistic prophecy.
Maybe dualistic fulfillment.
There you go.
Is
Dualistic fulfillment, which basically is that a prophecy can come that has both a near and far, a now and not yet truth to it, fulfillment to it. Does anyone want to speak to that real quick?
Well, just that's not uncommon in the Bible at all. Like you said, it's not something that's peculiar. It's something we see over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, part of the reason that the Jews would say that they missed the coming of Jesus is because of Messiah, and they argue about that, is because they're, Isaiah, as an example, prophesied about the kingdom that's coming, that is yet to come, and yet the king that was coming that did come. And so since they're all wrapped up in one prophecy, it had an immediate fulfillment, in the coming of Jesus. And then there's yet another fulfillment in the second coming of Jesus. So it's not a peculiar thing. It's not something like it's just some oddball thing, because there is dualistic fulfillment, throughout Scripture.
Yeah. And it even starts from the very first prophecy we have in the Bible. When you go to Genesis 3, and God's basically handing down sentences to Satan, to the woman, to the man. He says to Satan, like the woman's seed is going to crush your head. You're going to bruise his heel, right? Well, we know that when Christ came as a man the first time 2,000 years ago, he plundered Satan's house. I mean, it's pretty clear. When he was casting out demons, he was saying, this is my living room. I'm coming into your house and I'm going to do what I want in your house. He plundered the strong man's house. And yet Paul will say, in I think it's Romans 16, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your foot. So this thing happened, like Jesus came in, even from the first prophecy in our Bible, and there was a near fulfillment, a partial fulfillment, but there's going to be an ultimate fulfillment of that same prophecy in the future. So, and I think that makes sense probably. And that's common. Again, that's not unusual. That's common with prophecy.
I heard somebody gave me a word picture one time and it stuck with me and I liked it. If you've ever been hiking and especially lost, because that happened to me one time, you'll see a mountain and you'll think, oh, this is going to be the final mountain. That's all you can see. And then you get to that mountain because you're trying to find your car. And then you get past that one and there's another one that you're looking at. And you're thinking, maybe it'll be beyond this one. And that's kind of what this partial fulfillment is. All they could see was right in front of them. And yet there was something beyond that was, this was a partial fulfillment.
And each mountain was real when you got to it.
And each mountain was real. And so it's you get both of them. You just can't see them sometimes at the same time.
And so the take home is, as we go through end times things, is you see it's okay to see a fulfillment in the here and now, and yet in the same stream or in the same dialogue or in the same part of Scripture to see something that is not fulfilled. But we don't want to say, because that second part has not been fulfilled, that what we're seeing is not the first part fulfilled.
Right.
In other words, we don't have to marry those two together. That allows a disconnect between the two, even in one passage of Scripture.
That's good. That's really good.
And you'll see this in Matthew 24 pretty clearly as we start to get into it.
It is. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why it was a good idea to start with Matthew 24. Is it's a really good example on a lot of levels of how we should be looking at our Bibles when it comes to prophecy. So
right. And I think all of this just helps guard us against reading ourselves into this thing too much, knowing that there is in a lot of ways a near meaning and a far meaning to the various prophecies in the Bible, because it's at the end of the day, the Bible's not about me. It's not about us. It's about God and what he's doing.
That's right. That's good. Okay.
We should pray real quick before we jump right in.
Yeah.
I know we didn't do that, but we're about to read something that's heavy and hard.
Exactly.
So let's ask for wisdom. Father, we thank you so much for this study of end times and that we can look into these things. They're fascinating. They make us long for your coming. I hope they get people excited. I know it does me. And so as we open your word and as we look into these things, give us wisdom, give us understanding, help us to long for you more, and help us to learn from this in a way that will give us hope and benefit us. Maybe warnings at times when we need them. And so we just look to you right now and for your Holy Spirit to guide this time in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Okay. So let's go Matthew 24. We did ask you guys also to read the other accounts that are given, both Mark and Luke's, which was Mark 13 and Luke 21. We're not going to go through those tonight. Matthew's kind of the one that's most exhaustive out of the three, and so that's why we're going to deal with this one. But keep in mind what you read in those. Hopefully you went and you looked at those as well, because it does help fill in. I was amazed this week as I was looking at Mark and Luke, how it does give a slightly different angle that gives more. It just helps. So anyway, Matthew chapter 24. And what we're going to do is just kind of we're going to do a read through. So we'll take like a section of this, a chunk of this scripture, and then we'll stop and we're going to sightsee a little bit where we feel like sightseeing, and we'll keep our mouths shut where we feel like keeping our mouths shut. And we're going to move through the text that way. All right. Terry,
Yes.
do you want to give us a historical context? Because it sounds like you have one. Understood.
Well, this is the, I don't think there's a real extensive one that we need, except to know that this is in the last days, last week or so of Jesus' life. And Jesus and the disciples are finding themselves at the temple. Jesus has just really, as my friend David would say, thrown down on the Pharisees because of their hypocrisy, and pronounced woes on them because of the plain facts of his messiahship and everything had been laid out in his life and his teaching and everything about him, and yet they refuse to believe. Mm-hmm. And so, but they're standing by the temple. And this was probably, it's never been listed as one of the wonders of the ancient world. But after Herod restored the temple that was destroyed, it was built. I mean, it was magnificent. The walls on it were like 150 feet tall. It was a totally impressive structure. I mean, it just looked massive. It looked immovable, impregnable. I mean, like, this thing is here, right? I mean, forever. So, and Jesus and his disciples are near the temple. I think it begins with coming out of the temple. Mm-hmm. So that's the
perfect. Thank you. Are we all pretty much using ESV here? For the most part?
Pretty much not.
Terry's a black sheep. Pretty much. Who wants to read? Maybe just from 1 to, let's just go to 4. Let's stop at 14. Let's read straight through to verse 14. Anybody?
Sure. As Jesus left and was going out of the temple, his disciples came up and called his attention to its buildings. He replied to them, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down." While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples approached him privately and said, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming at the end of the age?" And Jesus replied to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famine and earthquakes in various places. All of these events are the beginning of labor pains. Then they will hand you over to be persecuted, and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Because lawlessness will multiply, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures till the end will be saved. This good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come."
Cool. So I think the first thing that we obviously see is establishing the context of this passage, of this chapter, which is this is a Q&A session that's going on. We have disciples that have come out, found Christ at the Mount of Olives, asked him a question about a comment that he had made, and now Jesus he's answering that question, right? And it's mostly concerning what? As far as the question goes that they had. What was the comment Jesus made about the temple?
You mean the one when he was referring to himself? Destroy this temple
yes.
And I will raise it up
yes.
in 3 days? Yeah.
Yes.
That one.
and
I thought you meant what we just read. I'm like, oh,
yeah, the one we just read. So yeah, he says there in 2, obviously, you see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will be left not one stone upon another. And then they come up and they ask him a question. Some people, I think even this can be debated, and so it may depend even on what version of the Bible you're using. Is this one question they're asking just in 2 different ways? Is this 2 questions they're asking? And even Mark and Luke here, this is where I found those most intriguing. was the way it's worded that they asked it in those accounts is a little different than they seem to have asked it in Matthew. But anyway, do you guys want to speak to that at all? This is basically the premise of this text that we're going through right now. So
I think they're asking what everybody wants to know, like how's this thing going to come to an end?
Yeah. Okay, you mean as far as the temple?
Well, he says, tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, how's this all going to come crashing down?
Okay.
The temple, the world, all of it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. You guys good with that? Both. All right. Thumbs up from Brent. Terry's nodding his head.
Yeah.
All right. He's good too. What else do you guys see there that's interesting in the first 14 verses that's worth mentioning? That's worth bringing out?
I think verse 3 is important because it tells us that the disciples came to him privately. I remember, depending on what end time view you have, I was taught one time, no, he's not talking to Christians. He's talking to, all of the Pharisees, and everybody's out here and they're all hearing him say this. And it says I think in Luke, it names 4 disciples. Yep. It actually names which ones came. His followers came to him privately, and he's addressing his followers privately. And that's important.
That's real important. So he's speaking specifically here, and this is what Terry was saying earlier, is it's important to know who's being talked to and, who's doing the talking and what the intention is. He's talking here to 4 of his disciples privately. This isn't a public Sermon on the Mount that he's doing to a multitude. This is 4 of his guys privately. So,
and not to get too far ahead, but the reason that's important is because later he's going to start telling these guys what to be looking for. And again, it's important to know that there's an assumption that they're going to be there to see it. So,
yep. Very good. Very good.
Okay.
What else is worth bringing out there? And that's actually a great point to bring out, by the way.
Well, there's kind of a key statement, I think, in verse 36 of the previous chapter, when Jesus had been talking about all the things that are going to happen, that were actually, there's got kind of an Old Testament flavor to it, because it talks about the prophets that they killed, and that there's going to be scourging and persecution from city to city. And in verse 36, Jesus says, this is chapter 23, Matthew 23, says, truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So they're thinking, wait a minute, you mean all this heavy stuff? Well, when in this generation? And then he goes to tell them about lamenting over Jerusalem, and they're kind of thinking, Jerusalem seems like it's doing fine, and the temple's here. I mean, what's the shakeup? Mm-hmm. Jesus is telling them something heavy's coming down, and they're kind of, and he's already said it's going to be in this generation, so they're kind of going, well when's that going to be? That was the question I'd ask. It's a question you'd ask. That's why it's important to, realize that this is a discussion that was private, that they had. And so we need to look at this in terms of what Jesus' answer meant to them.
Well, in 36, the last chapter, I believe that was public. So I believe he was in the temple area speaking publicly, and he was basically like shaming the Pharisees. He was speaking directly to the Pharisees there. So, but now he's speaking privately to his disciples. But yeah, remember that phrase. This generation basically is going to see all these things. All these things are going to come upon this generation. Chad, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's a couple of imperatives. So I made a list this week of just some of the different imperatives throughout 24 and even a little bit into 25. But there's a couple of imperatives in the verses that we just read. And one is an imperative is like, here's what you must do, right, in light of who God is. And so one of them is see that no one leads you astray. So that's something that we ought to pay attention to. In verses 4 and 5. In verse 6, it says, see that you are not alarmed. And so part of our kind of preparedness or being ready is not being led astray and not being alarmed. Mm-hmm. And I think we can easily be led astray, and we can easily be alarmed. And many people are when we start to think about the end times and just some anxiety that might come with that, wondering how and when and who and all of those things. And so we're just told, don't be led astray and don't be alarmed.
And he's talking to 4 of his disciples, which we already established. So how soon did this start?
Right.
How soon did the counterfeits come onto the scene and start leading people astray and doing their thing? Right.
Right.
Like It didn't take long.
It didn't take long. Well, just from our study in Galatians, we know that, just a few years into the church as we know it, they were being led astray, and probably happened even before that time. But
well, and the other thing that I think we talked about, the dual fulfillment thing. So as we go through this, you're going to see that he's saying some things to them that are going to apply to right there, and then he's also saying some things that are going to apply to maybe here and now. And so I know people are wondering right now, some of the things that are just talked about in verses 4 through 8, earthquakes in various places, like, I don't know, Idaho.
Yeah.
That's
and Utah, like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
like
Utah.
places
By
you
the
usually
way,
don't have
in Utah, I don't know if you guys saw this in the news, but when the earthquake rocked Utah, the angel Moroni, in the Mormon temple holds that little horn. The earthquake shook the horn loose. So it just showed him with his fist to heavens because the horn fell out. That's kind of funny.
and scary.
Kind of scary too. Yeah. Side note, had nothing to do with anything.
Yeah,
But
let
when
alone
you look
symbolic.
Don't encourage them right now, Brett.
I know. I'm sorry.
Okay, don't read into that one. Don't read into that one.
Yeah. Send your comments to Chad.
No, but I'll talk to Brent later privately.
But he says very clearly, don't be deceived. You're going to start to see things happening. Don't be deceived, and don't be alarmed. They're important. They're significant. But it doesn't mean every time there's an earthquake or a famine or a rumor of a war that we need to go up on the hill and wait for the Lord to come. It says the beginning of birth pangs, or the beginning. It's like it's contractions. Like you start to have contractions before. Well, my wife. We have 5 kids. I know nothing about this, but I'm going to pretend like I could watch the little monitor thing, and when they got really bad, you could see them go. So, but you could tell as it got closer to the time, they increased. And so we will see these things increase. It just means that we're nearer now than we were,
we're closer today than we were yesterday.
That's what I'm trying to
There's
say.
another thing that's significant here too. Can I talk to you for a minute? So there's another thing along the same lines that I think is significant, because he's not just saying, hey, there's going to be these things going on with nations being at unrest, with creation being at unrest, but things are going to happen to you that are so heavy, that are so against you, so opposed to you, that it's possible that you can question if this is what's supposed to be happening. He tells them, like, people are going to try to put you to death. Like, people are going to try to clean you out and wipe you out, but it's okay. Like, the end is not yet. And so, like, that's pretty heavy too. And that's a good thing for all of us to remember, the church as a whole, no matter where we're at and what the opposition is against the gospel. It doesn't mean God's against us. It doesn't mean that we've missed the boat, and that something's gone wrong. It's actually what's supposed to happen.
And it should actually encourage us. As we see these things increasing, it means his return is nearer. So,
but even if we take this to one of the problems of the verse 6 things that I think of, and I'll just throw this out there for you to think about too, is that now when there's an earthquake in Idaho, we hear about it in 15 seconds. When there's an earthquake in Malaysia, we hear about it in a minute or two. Wars, the same thing. I mean, but in those days, that didn't happen that way. I mean, there would be rumors of things, and information traveled person to person and like that. And anybody that's ever been in I know you people don't gossip, but by the time some information gets from one person to the sixth person, it's been distorted. And one of the things about the rumors of war is that between the rule of Caesar and Vespasian, I think it was, the Roman Empire, which was the kingpin, right? I mean, they were calling all the shots in that part of the world. Well, really, in all their known world, and there was instability in that, and in the Roman government and with the Roman military, and so the thing that they thought that even though they didn't like it, they thought they could count on was Roman rule, and that was being kind of chinked away at, and it was unstable, and so they could have been hearing about that kind of thing, and well, maybe the Romans are going to disappear, and this isn't going to be a thing anymore. And the same thing with some of the other things. It's just that news traveled a lot slower.
It's good. That's a good point. Good thing to remember. I kind of see this more as an overview, like just an immediate kind of overview of the answer to the questions. And then he kind of goes back and fills in some details. But there is one thing here that's extremely important. When will the end come, and what dictates that?
was the other thing that I wrote down, or
Boom.
that I typed. And it's in verse 14 that says that the gospel will be proclaimed throughout the whole world, and then the end will come.
Boom.
And so kind of as we often talk about, like, that brings us back to the mission of the church, the mission of the Christian here on earth. That we're not here just to kind of ride it out, suffer through some hard things until it gets a little bit better, but we actually play a role in ushering in the end in our gospel proclamation. Not just corporately as we gather week to week, but all of us as we scatter throughout the week, that we get to play a role in ushering in all these things.
So the carrying out of the fulfillment of the Great Commission through the church is what will bring the end. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Yeah, and the other cool thing to think about is, God knows all of this, and he's not going to come back too early or too late. When the last person believes that he knows is going to believe, he's coming, and he knows that, and it's comforting to know that he's got a timetable figured out already, even though we don't know it. He does. That's comforting.
Sure. Okay, shall we take the next section? Otherwise, we're going to be here all night. Shall we read another section?
Sure.
Chad, 15 to 31?
15, all right. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on his housetop not go down and take what is in his house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if in those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See that I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will be. You said through 31?
Yeah.
Immediately after the tribulation, in those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, as they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the heavens with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
All right, who wants to take a stab at this abomination of desolation thing? Where does it come from? I mean, he kind of hints at where it comes from, but
It was from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, I think. I could be wrong, but I think that's what
it's right
sticks in my head.
somewhere.
It was foretold that there would be this time when something happens in the temple that shouldn't happen, that makes the temple desolate, like they have to clear it out. That's the short answer.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's fine. And so he's saying that he's telling his disciples right now, this is going to be a sign of some serious troubles, of things falling into place, right? Have there been abominations of desolation that have occurred?
Yes.
Have there been people that have walked into God's temple that really had no business being there, doing things in that temple that weren't supposed to happen there?
I think the one people think of often is I think it was 168 BC-ish, 167 maybe, and that was
Antiochus
Epiphanes, who slaughtered a pig in the holy place. And but I think when he says let the reader understand, he's letting them know
it's not that one.
When you see this take place, he's saying let the reader understand, because they would immediately go, we've seen that we know what you're talking about. No, we're talking about something else. And one of you guys can talk about what the other thing is. if you want. I can
Do we need to talk about the other thing?
Well, there was a guy by the name of Gaius. I think it was in 40. So like it would have been like 8 years after this that came into the temple. And as I remember, he erected the sign of it. Well, we have to kind of get down to the end of the 28th verse where it says, "Wherever the corpse is, there where the vultures gather." That's can also be translated, "There can the eagles gather." It's literally carrion eaters, and eagles, as much as we think that they're a great symbol of all this good stuff, they're basically carrion eaters. So, and that was a symbol that was emblazoned on all of the standards and everything of the Roman army, right? So this guy Gaius comes in and he adorns the inside of the temple with all of this Roman bling. And that was, some people considered that was the, one of the abominations too. This thing that was set aside, including the Holy of Holies for God's, his dwelling place in the temple, for the Romans to come in and defile it that way with their symbols of, all of their pagan stuff like that. That was one that they considered.
For sure. And it is important what Brent points out is that there is an event that clearly happened that was renowned to the Jewish people. And that's when Antiochus Antiochus Epiphanes came in. He was, I think, from Greece.
Yeah.
Came in and basically plundered the place and slaughtered a pig on the altar in the temple. And then they carried him off to captivity or scattered him or I can't remember the history fully on that.
Well, it started the biggest Jewish rebellion in history.
Okay, there you go.
That's the Maccabees.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And yet Jesus is saying, even though this was spoken of in Daniel and you guys have seen this before, when you see it yet future. So he's saying it's not that one. It's not the one you saw. And this is important.
Yeah.
And so again, this speaks to an idea of dualistic prophecy, like we talked about earlier. Like there's sometimes you got a mountain behind a mountain behind a mountain, and it's
well, and the next mountain I think would have been AD 70.
Exactly.
When you see Titus.
Yep.
The Roman general comes in, and that's when the temple gets destroyed.
Yep.
And it was, we see these warnings coming of when you see the troops starting to gather around Jerusalem, get out now. And the Christians knew to do that, and they did it. And it's good they did because I think they said something like 1 million Jews were killed at that time. And the temple was destroyed completely.
Yes.
And so, Titus is the next fulfillment of this thing in AD 70.
And even the fulfillment of the not one stone.
Yeah, the temple was
on another.
literally, leveled to
Yeah.
the point where, and this is, when you think back to how Terry was describing this temple, it was magnificent. It was huge. And they wiped it out completely.
Yep.
And so there's no mistaking, when they saw that,
Yep.
they were like, oh, we
Yep.
know what Jesus was talking about there.
And that was roughly 40 years or so after Jesus saying this right here. That
70.
went down.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that, one of the many things is that normally when there would be a threat or something, people would run into the city, right? Get behind the walls, all that kind of stuff. And Jesus is saying here clearly, that ain't it.
Yep.
Don't go here. Run out to the hills and don't delay.
That's right.
In other words, this is going to happen quick. There's going to be there's going to be a devastation here like there hasn't been before.
With no time to spare.
With no time to spare.
Yeah.
That's right.
And
Pregnant women.
some of you might be familiar with Josephus, who is basically our best source for history at that time. He was living during that time in Jerusalem. He was a Jew, and he's an historian, and you can still read his stuff today. But when you read what he wrote, his description, his blow-by-blow commentary of AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, it wasn't good. It was absolutely, like Terry's saying right now, it was absolutely devastating. I mean, the Romans came in and for 3 days just handled business.
Well, and it would have been to them a time of great tribulation.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Everything he's saying here, again, you see it apply.
Exactly.
So that's the hill. But then I believe there's a hill beyond that hill that they didn't see coming, which we're going to get to, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guess?
I don't want to give away the end of the story. Spoiler alert, there might be another one coming.
So like Terry says, what follows that and what we just read is this urgency, this immediate evacuation. Don't even mess around. Don't even think about whatever you think's important. It's not important. Just go. And he kind of speaks to that there. And then we have the false Christ thing that's mentioned again, about Jesus being here or Jesus being there. He's in this room. He's in that, part of the wilderness. So that's going to continue there. And I do think it's interesting. And I was going to kind of save it till the end, but it's 27, verse 27 is really, really important for us to understand. This is one of those things that we can put in the bank as far as an eschatology to build, that when Christ comes back, it's not secret, it's not exclusive, it's not private. When Jesus Christ ultimately comes back to collect his church and set everything right, it's going to be like a lightning flash from the east to the west. Everybody's going to see it. There's not going to be guessing. There's not going to be misinformation. Like, it's going to be noticeable. In fact, Acts 1 tells us that clearly when they watched Jesus ascend into heaven, and the angels are like, "Why are you guys troubled? He's coming back the same way." Like, we're going to know. So,
well, that's this is controversial but significant, because again, there's a teaching out there that teaches that there's going to be this secret coming of Jesus that only he comes back to get the Christians and take them away. Pre-trib rapture, left behind, all of that stuff. We're beginning to tip our hand. Brace yourself.
Yep. Buckle up.
But here he's saying very clearly, if you hear about people saying that I've come, don't believe it. When I come, this is what you're going to see. It's going to look like lightning in the sky from all four corners. It's not going to be something like, and even in Thessalonians, at one point they said, did we miss it? Did we miss your coming? Because people have been saying, did we miss it? And he says, no, look at what I told you to look for. And he repeats some of this same stuff, the Abomination of Desolation. He says, there are things you can look for that'll tell you. You can't miss it, is the idea that's given. So,
that's right.
Yep. Well, even his illustration, as lightning flashes from the east, even to the west. With lightning, you can have your back turned to the east, and if lightning's over there, you can see it in the direction of your face.
Yep.
You don't have to be watching. So it's kind of one of these things like nobody's going to wake up the next morning and go, "Did he come?"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that ain't happening.
That's right.
Because it's going to be visible to.
That's right.
Well, it gives the vulture and the carcass thing. He's going to talk about the fig tree in a minute too, but the vultures thing. If you see a vulture circling, you know what that means. It's like, oh, I know exactly what that means. And he's saying this kind of thing too. When you see this, you're going to know what it means. There's not going to be any mistake in it. You see it up in the sky, you're going to know what it means.
We don't need to read too far into that. It's a weird saying.
It is.
But he's just making a plain point. If we're driving a car down the middle of a field, there could be a carcass in that field, and we wouldn't even know unless there's vultures that are sitting on the carcass. Then we know where the carcass is. We know there's a carcass in that field, and we know right where it's at. And that's all he's.
Hopefully you guys are done with dinner.
Yeah.
It's after 7, so sorry if you're eating chips in your stretchy pants.
Verse 29, I think I want to point out real quick.
Perpetuate it.
Verse 29 is a good example of what we were talking about earlier, where there's language in the apocalyptic literature and prophecies sometimes that's spoken in a way that's different than you or I would speak it. So we have a couple options with verse 29. We could take it literally, that the sun's darkened and that the moon doesn't show its light, that the stars are shaken from heaven, or there's about 5 other interpretations you can do with that kind of language. And this is where we need to hold loosely to trying to pinpoint what exactly this is. Do you guys agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Okay.
And I think it's the same kind of thing. Like when it happens, you're going to know.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
Whatever
the
your
thing.
interpretation of it is now, when it happens, it's going to be obvious.
There won't be any missing it. It's going to be unlike something we have. It's not like something we've seen before.
Because again, Josephus, if you look at his account of AD 70, he uses this same type of language to describe what Jerusalem looked like after the siege. Like the sun basically lost its light. Why? Because there were so many fires and there was so much smoke that it blocked out the sun. You know what I mean? Like there was so much just carnage. There were so much just explosions and just intensity of the attack that it's like the stars were shaken from the heaven. And so obviously we don't want to go too far that way either and just allegorize it all, but there's different ideas.
Well, and there are just, if you're keeping score at home, there are 2 camps that would say that AD 70 was the fulfillment of these things, not the return of the Lord, but the fulfillment of the stuff we're reading. And that would be the all-mill camp, all-millennial, and post-millennial camps. They would argue that AD 70 was that marker for these things happening.
Yeah.
We don't. I don't think any of us. A couple of guys are still unaffiliated. They don't know. But,
Undeclared.
yeah.
Well,
And that's a better
yeah.
word, undeclared.
And I would actually say that there is
that too.
Right.
there is a
There's a fine
possibility
line.
in the way that Christ intended this, like the way that he described this to those 4 disciples, that it does all fit into what they experienced in AD 70. Like, I wouldn't deny that at all. It doesn't mean that that's the once and done fulfillment of everything he's saying. But again, we're going to come to a comment where that's hard, that's troublesome, where he's going to say, this generation's going to experience all this. Well, what does that mean? You know what I mean? And so it's possible that everything that Christ describes actually applies to what they experienced as well in AD 70. Like, I wouldn't put it past that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and that really is for preterists and people that hold to a amillennial view would say that is the reason right there, is because Jesus promised the people that were listening to him that those things wouldn't pass. Now, this isn't just a kind of a one-trick pony where there's one aspect to this. So it can have an aspect of fulfillment then, and yet a future fulfillment too. And it's interesting because Jesus, the accuracy that he predicted these events, that within one generation, which is generally considered 40 years, right? That within one generation, and the time that he said that was between 32 and 33. So if you add 40 to that, that's 72, 73. And so in 70, with clockwork precision to his prophecy, Titus leveled Jerusalem. And so that's incredible. I mean, accuracy in the prophecy. And then they'll turn around and say, yeah, but all these other things didn't happen yet. And so that gets to the dualistic thing of the nature of prophecy, where one doesn't have to be connected to the other for both of them to be true. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's making sense for you guys. That's the whole reason we talked about dualistic prophecy to begin with, is what Terry said.
I can't answer the phone, but you can text me. So they,
You're getting a phone call.
I am.
Who is it?
I'm not saying
What are you
who it
gonna
is.
say?
We said we wouldn't name names.
No, we said we wouldn't name names of those.
Yeah,
athletes.
dude,
Yeah,
Why'd you
come
call?
on, we
It's
want
fair
to know.
It wasn't Walt.
Okay,
Okay.
Walt, you're off the
So
hook.
you're good. So I guess one of the ideas there then is that if this was a fulfillment of what took place there, and there's a future fulfillment, then the same thing would be true. If we see the abomination of desolation, that generation won't pass away.
Yeah.
Before he comes.
Correct.
Is I think a safe
Yes,
parallel
agreed.
to those
Yep.
things.
So there's two ways to look
it's
at
not
that. Yeah.
inaccurate.
That's right.
People stumble over this and say, well, he should have been back by now.
Right.
No, if it's dual prophecy,
That's right.
then you're going to see both of those things
Yep.
be
Near
true.
and far.
Yeah.
Boom, boom, boom. All right.
Oh, by the way, if I can go back to 22,
Yeah.
because I think
I'm
it's really
sorry.
good.
Yeah. Go back.
No, it's okay. This is really cool to me. It says, unless those
Yeah.
days were cut short, no one would be saved, but those days will be cut short because of the elect.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just see the heart of God for his people. I know a lot of people worry about end times and what's going to happen. And are we going to, if we do have to walk through some of the great tribulation time and some of these things, what does that mean for us? But God hasn't forgotten us. He loves us. He's going to protect us. Doesn't mean anything, bad things won't happen to us. Quite frankly, a lot of Christians are going to lose their heads during this time.
That's right.
So we know that that's true, but you see this idea of the mercy of God. He's aware of it, and he's mindful of it in a sense that he's going to get us through that time.
Totally.
I guess, so.
Totally. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else there, guys, before we move on?
Well, just one thing that you see in the all the way through, because the first thing when they ask the question is he doesn't begin to answer the question. He tells them what to beware of.
Mm-hmm.
Beware of false Christs, and then it says it again in verse 23. Then, if anyone asks you, behold, here is the Christ. For verse 24, for false Christs and false prophets will arise, and so forth. So there is a definite warning there to not be sucked in by things that don't conform to this.
It's good.
I mean, even though we don't know exactly what all this means, there are some fence posts here that we can see that things that don't conform to it, and so consequently we can heed the warnings, because it's a big part of it about not being deceived, not being sucked in by things that
Yeah,
don't
he's trying to
conform
make
this.
that point, isn't he? 30, of course, shows us again, verse 30, that this thing's not private. It's not secret. It's not exclusive. Like when Jesus comes back to do business, we're all going to know. Everybody's going to know. Everybody's going to be affected by it, like in every sense of the word. And then 31 is interesting. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call and will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. There's a little bit of speculation if this is an event at the end, or if this is a reiteration of what he said back in 14. Is this the church age? Is this the age we're living in now? You know, where right now he's got his angels right now collecting the elect, and yet it's written like it's an event. I don't want to sidetrack us, but like, you know, there's different ways. I just want to show you guys there's different ways that people have looked at some of this. Brent, what do you?
Well, I think it's an event.
Yeah.
Because when you read that, if you were to read that, if I were to just read this to you and say, what is this describing? Okay, Jesus is going to come back. You're going to hear a loud trumpet, and then he's going to gather his elect. That sure sounds like something that we would all think of as the rapture.
Yeah.
And I believe it's because it is. The word rapture is it's not something you find in the Bible, a catching up or a gathering.
We'll find it. We'll look at it next week.
But this seems to be describing a time when he gathers the elect.
Yeah.
And it happens at his second coming, at the end of the age, not before
at his appearance,
not before the tribulation period, after,
right,
when he appears,
right,
when everybody sees him, he's gathering,
right,
and it sure does seem like that describes.
Seems like an event at his appearing.
Yeah, event of what we would call the rapture,
yeah,
but just placed in a different spot than maybe you've come to expect. Well, and I don't want to go too far with this right now.
We're going to talk about it.
Are we?
Oh, well, a little bit, yeah.
Well, this is the reason that we're not trying to win you over to a side or an argument, but right now there's a lot of things going on in the world that are really disconcerting. And if you have been taught all your life that I'm going to be pulled out before this all takes place, and you're not, that's going to shake some people's faith. That's going to scare the, out of a lot of people. It's possible that's not the right view. And I think there's biblical evidence for it. And so that's the view I would vote for. If I got to vote, I would love to be raptured before anything bad happened to me. But if that's incorrect, we need to be aware of it, that maybe that's not the right view. And maybe we need to be prepared for it because, we definitely need to be prepared for it if that's the case.
And so Brent's not talking about that he doesn't believe in a rapture. He does believe in a rapture. The church believes in a rapture. Right. It's just when that rapture comes. And that's really, as we get into premillennial, pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib things that we'll talk about later, that's really what the debate is. When does it happen? And I think what Brent is saying is that there has been almost a cultural impact of some movies and books that were written to where Christians are just assuming that they're going to be snatched out or raptured before any of these things that Jesus is talking about
kept from
comes
bad
on
things.
us. Yeah, that we're just going to be.
It's
kept
very
from bad
American. Like I'm sorry, it's a very American thought in a lot of ways.
Sure. Well, it ties into what we talked about on Sunday of just having a theology of suffering.
Yeah.
The Christians are not immune to suffering.
Sure.
And just kind of taking the plain reading of this, like there's some suffering that's coming.
Yeah.
And don't be alarmed when it happens.
And there's a difference between the wrath of God being poured out on the earth and the wrath of man who hates Christians.
Yeah.
And if we don't discern that, like we're gonna confuse some stuff. And next week I kind of wanted to go into Thessalonians is where we'll go, where we'll actually hit the difference between the wrath of God and the wrath of men on God's people. Those are two different things.
This is significant because we need to understand that Christ on the cross bore the wrath reserved for us. That was the wrath that should have come upon us, and it went upon him instead.
Right.
So the idea that we would now have to bear God's wrath is not true for the Christian. He bore that. So when he starts opening bowls and seals and trumpets on the world, he's going to keep us through that time. And there's a passage.
We're actually going to talk about it right here in the next section.
Okay, well,
I believe it's here.
Yeah.
So
I think so too.
Yeah.
But so just be if we are going through that period of time, don't be alarmed. Okay, it may happen, but know that it's not a time when God's wrath will be poured on his people. We may suffer persecution at the hand of the enemy, just like thousands of Christians are being persecuted today in countries like, Turkey and North Korea and China, and we could go on and on, Indonesia. There's places where we're seeing Christians being persecuted left and right. It hasn't happened to us, so we think somehow we might be immune to it, but that's just not it's not a good biblical theology of
It's
suffering.
not a good biblical assumption.
It's
Yeah.
not at all.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
In fact, we're kind of we're the odd men out when it comes to suffering.
Mhm.
We've experienced a time when it's unusual in the history of Christianity to not see suffering.
Yep.
We've been immune to it for a while, and it looks like to me like it's changing, and we need to be ready for it.
Yeah. And is it
Yep.
fair to say that even, what's America's been around, a few hundred years, the eschatology of a pre-tribulation rapture of a church escaping hard times is pretty new. And so it's not weird to me that you have this nation that's been protected, been safe, been prosperous, and you also have this eschatology that matches the way that we live. Like, it's not a coincidence. So,
It is, just so you know, timeline wise, the pre-tribulation, the pre-tribulation rapture, that idea of being pulled out before the tribulation, came about in the 1800s. It was
Right, yes,
Darby. In that range, there was a group of people. That's where that idea first comes on the scene historically.
Yeah. And
you can check
we'll
that.
actually talk a lot more about the rapture next week when we get into the Thessalonians passage, because that's where we have the word caught up. That's where we have the word rapture. And so we'll discuss that a little more. Do you want to read the lesson of the fig tree?
Me?
Yes, sir.
Sure. All the way through 41?
Just go. We'll actually just do 32 through 35.
35. Okay.
Yeah. And then we'll take home stretch.
Sure. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away.
This is part of the reason that we're doing this, and I think we spoke to this last week. Why are we doing eschatology? Like, the main thing that we see over and over again are warnings, but watchfulness. The church is to watch. We read this in Matthew 25 a couple of weeks ago with the virgins and the lamps. Christ wants us to be fully conscious as a people, expectant of him, waiting for him, being watchful, and he's giving us signs. He's telling us things to help us know what season we're in and what to look for. And so we cannot know the day or the hour, which we will come to. Nobody knows that. We're going to read that next. But we can know the seasons. We can discern the seasons, and the Lord wants us to. So, and I think that's kind of what he's speaking to there with that. I also love that everything that Jesus is saying, as ridiculous as it seems, as far-fetched as it may seem, as impossible as it may seem, it's going to happen. Like, if Christ says that he's going to do something and something's going to go down, it's going to happen. Heaven's going to go away as we know it right now. Earth's going to go away as we know it right now. Nothing, though, that he has said is going to pass without it happening. All of it is going to occur. And I guess that's what we got there. So anyone else want to add to that?
Just in 33, I think what you said, David, is so important as a take home for us. So you too, when you see these things, recognize that he's near, right at the door. Mm-hmm. That the whole point of is not necessarily knowing what fits what or what order everything comes in, but we're seeing these things. We have seen these things. We've seen some of the things. The disciples saw the things that he predicted, coming true in 70 AD, mm-hmm. right?
Yep.
And we see these things, and the whole point is to recognize that it's the saying he's right at the door is to say that his coming is imminent. Somebody that's at the door can come through at any moment, right? They're not coming up to the door, they're at the door. And that's what he's saying here. And that's so important for us to, that's what he tells them is when you see these things, recognize this. You don't have to recognize all of the component parts or see how it fits together. But when you see these things, recognize that it's about to happen.
Right.
Yep. And be ready.
Go ahead and take us from 36 down to
41.
44.
44. Okay, in verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 men will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other will be left.
You want to go down to 44?
Oh, I'm sorry. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would have not allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will.
And I know that some of you right there, when Terry read that section, went, there's the rapture. Is there a problem with that?
Where my mind went, and forgive me because this might not be a great analogy, but remember the Noah movie from several years ago, the one with Russell Crowe?
I didn't see it, but I
There's
just,
a couple of really bad ones.
Right, not a great movie, not recommending it at all, but there was this scene in the movie that just was really sobering for me. I grew up in the church, right? And you had like the Sunday school story of Noah and the animals of the ark, and it's just kind of this happy story. Well, there's a scene in this movie that it just had never occurred to me until I'm sitting in the theater watching this, and it was when the flood happened. There were all these people outside of the ark drowning in just the flood waters as they're rising. They're just banging on the side of the boat. Yeah. And it pans to Noah and his family sitting inside the boat, hearing the screams and hearing the bangs of people on the outside. And it just it was sobering to have like that picture. It kind of messed me up for a few days after the movie. It just wouldn't leave my mind.
Yeah.
And as he talks about here, as in the days of Noah, people are just going to be going about their business.
That's right.
Oblivious to the fact that Christ is coming back.
Right.
And it's going to happen.
Right.
It's going to happen, and it's a sobering thing when it does.
Yeah, absolutely.
For those that aren't ready.
Yeah, this should propel us to love our neighbors more today when we look at things like this, rather than going I'm glad I got my ticket. We should be looking outside the ark to those who will be outside the ark if they don't turn.
Well, the door on the ark's still open.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, right?
It is.
Yep. Jesus Christ is still an open door right now, today, while you can find him.
And there's a couple imperatives on my list of imperatives in that passage where it says, be ready is an imperative for the Son of Man is coming in an hour that you do not expect. A couple of verses before that says, stay awake because you don't know on what day your Lord is coming. And so just a couple more imperatives pay attention to what's about to go down.
And again, it's, this falls right after he talks about the fig tree. So understand, he said, look, I've given you things to look for. I've given you things to watch for. It's not going to be a total surprise. So it's not that we won't know the season of his coming, but the day and the hour,
that's correct.
We don't know.
That's right.
And so there's a difference in those things. So we will have signposts. We will have things that we'll say, okay, we can connect the dots to his coming. He's at the door.
Exactly.
But we won't know the time exactly. And so we should be living always as though it could be like he's at the door.
Yeah.
But there's things we can watch for.
There's a great hermeneutical example here too in this passage, and that is that he brings up Noah. He starts with an example that they're familiar with to help them understand what it is he's about to say. Basically, he's helping them interpret properly what it is he's about to say by using the example of something they know, which is Noah. And I was taught that this is a passage that teaches the rapture. People would point at it and say, there it is. One is, in fact, our most popular series that the church has is called Left Behind. Where does that come from? It comes from basically these words here. I want you to just consider, though, okay, who was taken and who was left when God judged the earth in the days of Noah, right? You got two people stay. One was taken by what, and one was preserved by what. So we like to think that we're the ones being taken. There's the rapture, but it's actually more than probable that it's the opposite. Mm-hmm. It's those who are godless are the ones who are taken by the judgment, and it's those who are gods that are protected through it. And again, this goes back to that we're not appointed to wrath. It doesn't mean that we escape it and we're not present. It just means that we're protected, just like Noah was protected from the flood, just like the children of Israel who put a mark on their doorpost were not taken out of Egypt first, but they were kept from the judgment, and everyone else was taken by the judgment. That seems to be more what Jesus is saying.
Well, he
here.
says so clearly in 39, they didn't know until the flood came and swept them all
And took
away.
There you go.
It took them.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, the flood took them.
Yeah.
And God is coming. You're going to see the lightning.
Yes.
You're going to see him coming in the clouds. And at that point, it's too late.
Yes.
They will be taken to judgment
Yes.
at that point. And
Yeah.
that's the,
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know this might hurt a little bit, but just consider it. Just consider what we're saying, that it's actually the opposite
is
of
anybody,
what you were
is
taught.
anybody still tuned in?
45 devices are still tuned in, so we haven't lost anybody.
So can I say something
You
about
can
a
say as much
question?
as you
A
want.
question that maybe some people are thinking about, because I've heard this a lot, that it still seems to really stumble amongst other things in this passage. And that is that Jesus says, but of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone.
That's weird.
So Jesus is God, right?
Yep.
He's as much God as God the Father, and yet it says that he does not know. And this has stumbled a lot of minds that are, a lot better than ours.
The kenosis. Should we talk about the kenosis?
Well, we could talk
Go to
about
Philippians
we could
2
talk
and-
about that.
Okay.
But Thomas Aquinas, who was a Catholic theologian back in the long time ago, and a brilliant guy, he answered this by saying this. He said, well, Jesus really knew, but they couldn't handle it, so Jesus didn't tell them. Now, if you think about that,
That sounds like a lie.
that it is a lie.
Right.
It is a lie. But by his thinking, it forced him into a corner that he could at least answer the question. It's not a very good answer, but he could answer the question. And I read a guy that put it this way. Jesus was fully human, and Jesus is fully God. And you see Jesus getting hungry. You see him. Gods don't get hungry. You see him being tired. You see him sleeping in a boat. And all these things are things that are confined to humanity. And so the way that the guy put it was something like this. I would rather see Jesus giving way to his humanity here in this as a man than sin invading both the God and the man nature. And so I think that we can just say, that Jesus' humanity was not mixed up with his godness. They were, like the creed says, they were separate. They were not, combined. They were not mixed together. He was fully man and fully God. And in his humanity, Jesus said the Son, which refers to his humanity, the Son of Man. He says the Son doesn't know. Now, why it is that the Father knows, I've heard about, the whole thing about the Jewish weddings and all of that, where the father of the bridegroom was the one that blew the whistle that said when the bridegroom was going to come and get the bride. I don't see any of that imagery here. I just see Jesus describing himself as a human here and saying that the Son doesn't know, but the Father does. And by extension, nobody knows and nobody's going to figure it out. So when you hear the next trumpet call for people to go up on top of Mount Bachelor and wait, that's because they've got it figured out when the day and the hour is. That's not a good time to go.
Agreed. That's good, Terry. And that is a tough one to think about, the statement that Christ makes there. That he's God, of course he knows, is what we would automatic. But he's actually, either he's lying or he's telling the truth. And there's got to be, it comes down to the hypostatic union, even just the reality that he was 100% both at the same time, which is, I'm going to do a Chad. Like, good luck getting a hold of that one.
It's a mystery, I would say.
Yeah.
Are we ready to to jump into some questions, or you got more that you want to hit?
So
We got
really
some
quick,
more.
I don't have more. There's another parable that kind of follows up. We don't need to hit that if you guys don't want to. But I did want to real quick, if I can find it. Actually, let's do questions, and then I'll do what I was going to do at the end.
Okay.
All right. Because I don't know where it's at. So.
I gotta look.
So yeah, one question while you're looking, Brent. Could you please explain the terms amillennial, preterist, and the other viewpoints?
It would take some time to do that, and so what if you guys are you mentioned maybe doing it later, but there's a really good concise article that Piper put out. It was written in '87, but he basically just clearly defines all of these little terms, and I can probably just attach it as a PDF to the Facebook.
I would.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
that's
can
a
link
good
to it or
idea.
something.
so that he'll say it in a very concise way that's very clear, and I think it would take quite a bit of time to go through
Well,
all that right
just
now.
yeah, but just in broad categories, amillennial means without a millennium in a visible sense. It's like, it doesn't mean that they don't believe in a reign of Christ. They don't mean, amillennials don't believe in a literal earthly reign of Christ where Christ is present on the earth. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't believe in a spiritual millennium where Christ is reigning, or the physical return of Christ, or any such thing. It's just amillennials like asexual or something. It's an alpha. It's a
They would say they don't like because it means no millennium.
Right.
They believe in a realized millennium.
Right.
Like we're in the
Spiritual
millennium. We're in
They would say the
millennium now.
1,000 years is symbolic
Right.
for a period of time. That's all millennialism.
But that we're in it now in some form.
Yeah.
Yes.
And post-millennial believe the same thing. They believe that the millennium is happening in some form now and will usher in the kingdom.
Yeah.
Premillennial, which I think most of us maybe, well, I don't know. Premillennial is what I am. And so I still believe that the millennium is future. It's confusing, to be honest, and we might get into that later. But it hasn't happened yet. We're still looking forward to a 1,000-year period that hasn't occurred yet. And
so pre, post, and awe has to do with the timing of Christ's return, according to when the 1,000 years happens.
Right.
yeah,
Hopefully
all of
that
them believe
helps.
in the return of the Lord, where they place the millennium,
That's
which is the
kicker.
1,000-year
Yeah.
reign, figurative or
Yeah.
literal.
And then when it comes to futurist, historicist, spiritualist, and preterist, those labels actually have to do with your primary hermeneutic in interpreting end times prophecies. So preterist means immediate, basically.
Or
So
past.
or
These things
past.
in
So
the
they would
past, yeah.
look at something like what we just looked at tonight in Matthew 24 and say, this all happened completely at AD 70 with Titus when he came in, and it's done. It's sealed up. There's nothing more to be added to it. There is no further fulfillment of this. And there's not a lot of preterists like we were talking about earlier anymore, because it's hard to it's hard to be consistent with that view. The spiritualist sounds exactly like what it sounds, where they just over spiritualize or allegorize everything that they read. Nothing can be taken literal. Everything's just kind of got a spiritualistic meaning. Futurists are ones who tend to take some of this more seriously and literally, and say, no, these are real things that are going to happen ultimately in the future. And so I know that's like cheap, and this would take a lot of time to do, but the resource.
I'll try to send that out. I'll post it to the Facebook page,
Yeah.
or you can email me and I'll try to get it to you. And it doesn't answer anything definitively,
Right.
but it gives fair definitions for each one.
Yep.
It's pretty unbiased, except for I think he is post-tribulate.
And again, in ways, there's truths to each camp in different
Right.
ways. And that's why it's neat to find a work that handles all of them. In fact, I do have a reference for that, and we'll get to that down the road. But to find a work that's more non-biased, that just presents the different views, you'll find yourself looking from column to column going, wow, I see that, I see that, I see that. And so it just starts to show you that all of it is way bigger than a column or a box.
Yeah.
So
And Jesus didn't this is not an oversight by God. This is not where he's just given us incomplete information,
right.
or this is all deliberate. You remember Jesus said about the guy, if he knew when the thief was coming, right, he'd get ready at that time. I mean, he wouldn't get ready the day before or 2 days before that, or he'd get ready. So keeping us in suspense, if you want to call it that, means that since we, and to use his example, when we don't know the thief is coming, you live in perpetual
That's right.
readiness. And that's the whole point
That
of the
is the
thing.
point.
So it's not an oversight, and it's not like a oops, or why didn't God close this loop or something like that. I think it's very deliberate.
Agreed. That's a good point.
Okay, so one of the questions that came in, the holy place is in verse 14. Is this the temple? If so, it hasn't been built yet. So that was a question and an observation, I guess.
So,
More
yeah.
observation, but so that anybody want to comment on that? If we're going to see the abomination of desolation,
Right. So again, they did see it. If the holy place
Right.
that Jesus is talking about here is that place in the temple where sacrifice was going on at this time, then they did see this with Titus. He went in, he marched into that place, and he caused it to be desolate and then destroyed the temple. So I think the comment or the question or whatever is, there is no temple right now.
Right.
So if this is yet future, what do you have to have a holy place? Ding, 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 ding. Got to have another temple.
Right.
And of course, this is something that ever since Israel has come back into their country, they would love to retake the Temple Mount. They would love to have a third temple built. And yet there's something that's in the way. There's something in the way. And so like there's some stuff that would have to happen for this to go down.
and that's where you would take, if you take a literal approach to these things, you would have to say, yes, a temple has to occur.
Yes.
Is it possible there's something that God is going to, when you look back, you'll be able to figure it out a lot easier, but is there something that God's going to put in place that will be
Right.
like an answer to this that we don't understand or see? Maybe.
Well, I've heard, for example, that other people, mostly spiritualists, have said, well, the holy place of God right now on earth is his church.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's got to be someone who's going to somehow stand in the midst of the assembly of the church and cause some problems.
But if you take that, again, the hermeneutic on that is, if you take that and say that to the disciples and you say church, they go, what?
That's right.
Huh?
That's right.
What's that about? I mean,
That's
so
the
that would
idea
have been
that
anything
somebody
to them.
stands in the midst of the church and puts an apparent stake, in the heart of it. Obviously wouldn't be that, because the gates of hell won't prevail against the
Right.
church. But there could be something along those lines.
It's a stretch.
It sure looks like a temple would have to be rebuilt. This goes to a couple of the other questions that I got. We know the temple was destroyed in AD 70. Is Jesus implying another temple will exist just before he returns? And then the follow-up question was, could Jesus return tonight? And so there's the question again, if there's no temple and we're looking for these things, does it mean that he could return tonight? And it,
Live like you can.
live like you could is always the right answer. But it sure seems like these signs and these things he's told us to look for, there's still more to come, I would say, but live as though yes.
So a comment came in that says, could the Dome of the Rock be the abomination?
Standing in the temple. Wow. Never thought about that. That's clever.
I'm not even going to try to comment on that. That's interesting to think about.
It
but
is.
Well, and that's partly what I mean by, we have this way of trying to figure things out and make it neat and tidy and clear. And so we saw it this way before, so it's going to be that way again. But when you consider something like that, it's like, wow, it's a good thought.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe they should be here on the couch.
Yep.
There's a spot.
We salute you for that. That was interesting.
That's good. I got a long question here, so I'm going to try to read it while you.
I don't have any more questions at the moment. So. There were a few that came in, but I think we already kind of answered them, so I don't need to read
Thanks
them.
for your patience, by the way, going through this, because this is it's difficult. You have to really keep your thinking cap on, and you have to kind of rein yourself in, and at the same time let yourself follow the scriptures. And so I really appreciate you're hanging in there. Assuming we still have some viewers.
Okay, I'm going to read this question.
44.
It's
44.
kind of long, so here we go. It says, I have always looked at God's nature as never changing. God removed Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah right before he visited his wrath. He removed Noah and his family. Sorry, I just got another text and I covered it. I got to go back and find. He removed Noah and his family right before his judgment rained down. If the tribulation is God's wrath being poured out, and we are not appointed to God's wrath, wouldn't it be consistent with his nature to take existing Christians out before the seven bowls of wrath are poured out? If we know the end of the tribulation is 1270 days from the abomination of desolation, and no man knows the day or the hour, how can it be at the end of the tribulation?
So there is, like we said, we weren't going to do this, but even in Revelation, I think it's chapter 6 or 7, there is a point there of imagery where there's an angel that's sent out of the throne room by God to mark the heads of those who are gods before a bowl was poured out, or a trumpet, I can't remember. And so even though you see something like Sodom and Gomorrah, what you do see repeatedly throughout the scriptures is God protecting his people while he's doing business with the rest of the world.
Egypt is a great example.
Yes.
Egypt, blood on the doorposts, he did not remove them. It's not that case is not like, and I would even argue with Noah, he did not remove Noah from the earth.
flood.
No.
Noah felt every bit
Protected
with
it
his
through.
family, like he went through it, but was protected from it. And that's the pattern that we see over and over.
Well, and I
again
think
in
you'll
the
see in Revelation 3, I think it's verse 11, maybe 10, that's a passage that people will go to for the pre-trib rapture, and say God will keep his people, the church, from this. And it really could be translated very easily, kept through it.
Right.
And so the idea is, will we suffer God's wrath? No.
Right.
Will we suffer persecution? Because a lot of the tribulation period is more to do with persecution from people who hate Christians and who hate Christ than it is about his wrath. God's final, the end of the tribulation period is when he comes and deals with that, and wrath is poured out on the unbelievers, not unbelievers.
Right.
The other, sad answer to this question is there may not be any believers at the time that the bowls start getting poured out. When you look at the believers under the altar that say, how much longer before you avenge our wrath? And it's a number that can't be counted, who lost their lives during the tribulation period. There may not be.
Which means that they weren't absent from that terrible time. They were present.
They were present during the tribulation time.
Suffering the wrath of other men, not of God.
Exactly. So wrath of man, wrath of God. We won't suffer the
we
wrath of God.
We need to distinguish those two
and
things.
he can keep us through that time.
Yep.
So I hope that answers that.
I had a question come in. Do you think the fig tree is the Reformation of Israel?
Say that again?
Do you think that the fig tree is the Reformation of Israel?
The Reformation. Being reformed. Israel being like coming back together as a nation, perhaps?
Perhaps.
So these are the things, just like the Dome of the Rock comment, that are really interesting to consider and think about. And you go, oh, there's like a possibility there, but they're not things that we can draw absolute eschatology from.
Sure.
And so, yeah, it's fun to think about these things, but
the clear point of the fig tree is he's saying
is to be
guys,
aware.
Look
at the
when you
season.
see a fig tree, and these things start to happen, know it means this. That's the plain meaning of that. And when the plain meaning is obvious, stick with the plain meaning.
Right.
Can it mean something else? Yeah, maybe. But this is the obvious part. He's saying, guys, I'm coming. You're going to see these things start to take place. You're going to know that it means my coming's nearer. Watch for that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would go with more just the signposts and so forth.
Right.
And that's one of those kind of reverse hermeneutical things where you go, okay, so they say, well, could it be the Reformation of Israel? And what I would say is kind of a shortcut to what Brent said is, what in that text would make you think that? As opposed to when he talks about being ready and seeing the seasons and things like that. There's a good case to be made for that, but what in that text would make you think that it has to do something about the gathering Israel
Would we call
together
that
from the nations?
eisegesis?
It could be. It could be. But it's like one of those things. Well, it could mean that, but I think hermeneutically, you ask the question: what in this text would support that? And there has to be something for it to be a valid interpretation. There has to be some legs there in the text for it to stand on.
So a good hermeneutic is that we take what we do have and pull information from what is there, rather than starting with something that we think about and read it into what's not there. That's the difference, is extracting information rather than imposing information to come up with a doctrine, right?
And I will just say, by way of disclaimer, because I know all these guys feel this way, this is daunting stuff. We don't claim to have the market cornered on truth when it comes to this.
Students.
As much as I don't like saying it, humanly speaking, I know I could be wrong and we could be off on some of these things. So we're not arrogant enough to say we've got this figured out. There are lots of different views, like David started out by saying, godly people have different views about this. This is our best stab at it. And it's important, again, some of the things we're bringing out here, are important for you to consider, because if it does end up being a different way, we want to make you guys as prepared as possible for that as your pastors. So.
And if we do our job right, hopefully what you're seeing us do when we go to this text is comment on what's there, and pull what's there, and not just sitting here and imposing our own preferences and our own views. Like if you're seeing us do that, that's tough. But if you're seeing us come in here and make a point, even if it's something you haven't been taught or you don't like, hopefully you're seeing us pull it from here. And then you're going to have to deal with God on whether you like it or not. And so that's what we're trying to do. Is if we're doing our job, we're dealing with what's there and not just sitting around and imposing our framework upon you.
Sure.
Right?
And this is worth noting that, like, this is more than this isn't just a puzzle that we need to figure out.
Right.
We have to ask ourselves, like, if all of these things are true, like if the fig tree is like, if spring's coming, like what does that mean for what you do when you get out of bed tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
We can do what we can to try to figure out the pieces of the puzzle, and we can be proud of ourselves if we feel like we get some things right. But at the end of the day, God did not make this a mystery just so we would have a challenge of trying to figure it out. Like there's living to be done and doing to be done based on what we believe our eschatology to be. And there are people out there that don't yet know Christ. And so if these things don't drive us to proclaim the gospel, to display the gospel in the way that we live, to have concern, care, and love for our neighbors, and then we're missing it by a mile.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
We're an hour and a half in, David.
Are we an hour and a half in? Have you guys had enough already?
Well, you probably
I think we pretty much got through what we needed to.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you got to say the end parts.
Well, I lost my piece of paper disappeared. Like I tucked it somewhere that I wouldn't normally tuck it. So I finally found it.
They have homework too. I know that.
So let's just say this. I wrote down a few points, and you guys may have some too. What are the things we can take from this? There's a lot of stuff here that we can't really comment or like build doctrine on, but there are things that we can. And so I just mentioned wrote down 7 things that I thought of looking at this. One is the people of God, when the day of the Lord comes, the fullness of it, whatever that is, as Jesus is describing it here, are susceptible to troubled times. That's something that we see clearly in the text. The people of God, verse 9 specifically, we are susceptible when that time comes to trouble. Number 2, it is normal, not abnormal, for the nations and creation to be at unrest. Earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, that's normative, right? It doesn't just mean, and yet it will increase, it seems like. So that's something I think we can build into our eschatology. There's always been false Christs. I think we all know that, and they're prevalent, and we need to be aware of them. So that's something we can definitely learn. The final return of Christ is ultimately waiting on the fulfillment of the Great Commission. That's the end will come.
So get to work.
People. We want to go home. I'm just kidding. Number 5, when Jesus finally returns, it will not be exclusive or a secret. Everyone's going to see him. It's going to be a big deal. We can build that into our eschatology. Number 6, if Jesus says it, it's going to happen. Like he says that. Like this is going to pass away. That's going to pass away. The biggest things that we know of that he's created are going to go away. Everything he says is going to come to pass. And then the last thing I wrote that we can know eschatologically is we cannot know the day or the hour of his return, but we can discern the seasons, is what he's trying to tell us to do. So those are kind of just 7 quick things that I think we can build into our eschatology because of this passage. So
I liked what Chad said as a
Me
point.
too.
Just the idea that we can try to figure all this stuff out and spend a lot of time doing it and kind of just spin ourselves around the axle doing that. Or we can just simply say, man, this is coming. It's serious. There's going to be people that get swept away that aren't ready. What do I do about that? And so if there's something to focus on, how should we now live in light of the fact that he is coming, that things are amping up, that there's less hope, and it is really to really use this as a time to tell people about Jesus and that he is coming. He's returning.
Yep.
He's got a kingdom he's setting up that you're going to want to be a part of, and you're not going to be on the wrong side of that. Mm-hmm. So that's the biggest takeaway I can see in all this.
Absolutely. Yeah. So next week, we're going to look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 all the way through to chapter 5, verse 11. So 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 through to chapter 5, verse 11. And I would actually encourage you also to take at least the back half of 1 Corinthians 15 and read that too. Read those sections each day. And we'll come together next week and talk about those. So, yeah.
If you think of more questions or you want to just call and talk about any of this, I know we'd love to do that. I hope this is, to me, this is just fascinating. It's been a while since the church started. We really haven't been into this. And I just found myself, I was up till almost midnight last night just reading.
Yep.
I was so into it and so excited and so passionate about it that I found myself just scouring things. And I'm hoping that that's what this does with, for you as well.
And it's because it's encouraging your faith, right? It's encouraging, like it's sparking your excitement in God, who he is, his final victory, his ultimate victory, his coming for his church.
What's coming for us? What's in store for us?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. You were going to say something.
Oh, really? I really like what Chad said. I think that really sums it up, that our focus, even though and it's okay to chase down these trails and all these millennial views and all of these tribulational views and things like that. And, but the focus needs to be on it, on expectation and preparedness and evangelism and pushing out with the gospel. That's the whole thing. I was going to say, we've talked about people being on different sides of this. Some all-millennialists, J.I. Packer, R.C. Sproul, John Calvin, Michael Horton, some prominent post-millennialists, Jonathan Edwards, most all of the Puritans, John Owens, Richard Baxter, some of those, premillennialists, John MacArthur. Are some of these names ringing bells? There are theological giants all over the map here, but I think that by their ministries that even though they hold different positions, they're all have got their nose pointed in one way, and that is the salvation of men and the preaching and the prospering, the going forth of the gospel. And I think that it's easy trying to figure this stuff out, to get the focus on this thing or that thing and the other thing, and that's okay to have that figured out in your own mind, let each man be fully persuaded. But it shouldn't change our focus. Our focus should all be the same, regardless of what view we have.
I got a verse that'll tie a bow on it pretty good.
All right, tie a bow.
This is Hebrews chapter 9, verses 27 and 28. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who eagerly wait for him.
Amen.
Chad, you want to praise out?
Yep. Right. Father, we're thankful that what Brent just read is true. Thankful that you have granted us faith to believe it's true. And so we would pray tonight that you would give us wisdom as we dig through Scripture, as we endeavor to discover what's true about the end times. But more than that, we pray that what we do discover as being true would cause us a greater fervor in our evangelistic efforts, that it would cause us a greater love for neighbor, that it would cause us to greater degree to display and to declare the truth of the gospel in the way that we live and in the words that we say day in and day out. And so we would pray that the fruit of all of this would be people coming to know you, souls being saved, names being added to the book of life, because we know that it's true that you are coming back, even if we don't know exactly when it's going to happen. And so just be with us this week as we're just in a new week of being sheltered in place. Help us to care for one another well until we can meet again. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you guys.
Yeah.